So let us start with the definition and then a little bit about demographics, and then we will describe causes or associations, and then effect. So if we start with the definitions, what is suicide? So suicide is an act of causing one's own death, or what we call malicious self-murder. Though the definition says that most of the time the suicidal behavior is designed to solve a particular problem rather than to end life. In that, they commit suicide not because they want to die, but because they want to solve a problem. We'll talk about that later as well. Then, coming to deliberate self-harm, is an act with non-fatal outcome in which an individual deliberately initiates, that is, purposefully starts it in a non-habitual behavior. So there are people who habitually hurt themselves. We are not talking about that. But this self-injurious behavior, this deliberate act of hurting oneself, if not treated, can lead to harmful outcomes. So that is the definition of deliberate self-harm, which is a bit more problematic. Then we are looking at a classification of self-injurious behavior. This is from the Center for Disease Control in USA, Atlanta. So first, there is self-injurious behavior, which can be classified into three groups. One is suicidal self-injurious behavior, undetermined self-injurious behavior, and non-suicidal self-injurious behavior. What do we mean by non-injurious suicidal behavior? Is where people slightly cut themselves, making sure that nothing major harm is going to come, then taking a few tablets of overdose, knowing very well that it's not going to harm them. So that's where the non-injuriousness comes from. So now if you look at this first group here, suicidal self-injurious behavior can lead to three outcomes. One, of course, is suicide, where death is the outcome. Then we have another group called suicide attempt, and then other suicidal behaviors. Now, there is some intent to die that are not suicide or suicide attempts, like for example, interrupted attempts. For example, somebody might do all the stuff but not actually do the last step of killing oneself. So that will come into that. And also like risky behavior, purposefully driving fast, and other things could come into that group. So this is from the Center for Disease Control. Then if you go to epidemiology, as I said, the suicide rate is about 10 per 100,000 across the world, but we know it's 200 per 100,000. So there is a big difference between suicide and deliberate self-harm. Again, if you look at the age groups, the men commit suicide much more than women. Now here, worldwide, the ratio is 3:1, but again in Sri Lanka, it's not 3:1, it's much less. It's about 1.5:1. If you come to deliberate self-harm, the women attempt suicide more, and also the age group is much younger. The female to male ratio is 1.4:1, but maybe in Sri Lanka it's about 2:1. The marital status, usually deliberate self-harm, they are single, teenage married or separated. Most of the marital status about suicide, they are separated or divorced, again in the male group. So you can see there the two groups are quite different to each other. Now when we come to statistics about suicide, we are never accurate because there are many factors that interfere with counting. Sometimes deliberate self-harm or suicide is counted as a natural death when people are not clear. And also suicide carries some amount of stigma. it also causes problems in accessing insurance money. So very often, suicides are not classified as suicides, are classified as natural death or something else. So none of the countries in the world actually count suicide very well. So that's a problem. Though the exact rate of suicide is not available, trends in suicide, environmental factors and other factors that influence the trend can be a useful guide. As we saw earlier, men suicide more than women, and deliberate suicide is even more harder to study because many deliberate self-harm will not end up in hospital. For example, somebody who takes 5 or 6 paracetamol tablets may not come to hospital at all. Then how do we count it? So community surveys again are very difficult because nobody wants to accept that they have attempted suicide. But we can assume it's at least about 20 times more commoner than suicide. So how do we count suicide rates? Unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, we use police data to count suicide because hospitals don't carry that data. And police data can be not be very accurate. The Sri Lanka, the rate is about 28 per 100,000, though probably the real rate is a bit higher than that. In 1995, our rate was about 40%, which was very high, and we ranked one of the countries where suicide was most common. Still, it's a major problem in Sri Lanka. We will see some possible reasons for that. So, if you look at the worldwide magnitude of the suicide issue, about 1 million commit suicide every year. Suicide attempts about 10 to 20 million, but the number of population affected by suicide is much more. It's about 50 to 120 million. And also I gave the figures for the global burden in 1998 and in 2010. Then again, we looked at the age groups earlier. The peak age group for male suicide is 40 to 45 to 50, and for the women it's 21 to 25. In Sri Lanka, Sinhala Buddhists are supposed to commit suicide more. They have the highest suicide rates, followed by the Tamils. Muslims have the lowest suicide rate in Sri Lanka. So as you can see, religion also plays a part in suicides. Now, this is an important area we come to now, understanding the suicidal risks. There are many different risk factors for suicide. The first one is psychological factors. So mental illnesses are a very important cause for suicide. So roughly about 50% of people who commit suicide would be having a mental illness, and that mental illness would have contributed in a very big manner for the suicide. So as you can see here, if you have a way of diagnosing mental illness early and treating it properly, we are going to reduce the suicide rate by 50%. So that's a fairly straightforward, reasonable intervention that we can hope for. Then the next issue of hopelessness comes in. So hopelessness, a sense of, I have nothing to live for. And you see this commonly in old men who are single, who have lost their spouses, who are in retirement, or who have terminal illnesses. So though that doesn't fit into a diagnosis of mental illness, that comes a very important aspect. Then we come to a very important area called poor problem solving skills. Now this is attributed for the high suicide rate in Sri Lanka, especially among young people. Young people in Sri Lanka from their childhood, there is a feeling are not taught how to solve problems. Their parents, their teachers and others solve their problems for them. So when these young people have to face a problem on their own, they don't know how to solve the problem. So one of the obvious solutions that comes to their mind is suicide, which seems a simple, straightforward way of coping with the stress, the emotional distress they have, and that is considered one of the important reasons why you get a high suicide rate in Sri Lanka. Most of these suicides in this age group with poor problem solving skills are impulsive, poorly planned, and happens at the spur of the moment. Then we have alcohol use. Alcohol is a very important contributor to suicide, and as you know, Sri Lanka, we have a major alcohol problem, and this also could be contributing to the higher suicide rates. Then now we have done the psychological aspects, and now going to the microsystem things, family history and loss. So if there is a family history of suicide, again, this can be a learned behavior. My father had a problem, my uncle had a problem, and they solved it by committing suicide. Maybe I should do that too. Could be one reason that family history can be useful. And also loss of a family member can lead to an increased suicide rate. And also low levels of peer support. If we are alone, we don't have very good friends, we don't have a good support system, again, when we have a problem, we don't have resources, we don't have support to fall back to. And then again, the suicide rates can be quite high. Then we come to the system outside or the society, suicide in the media. Suicide and media is a highly contentious area. There is this concept of copycat suicide, where people look at television, news items and other medias and copy the same method of suicide. And this has been observed around the world in many different situations. And therefore, in Sri Lanka, many years back, a media policy was drawn up where the media will not glamorize or give importance or report suicide in a manner that could be stimulate other people to commit suicide. Sri Lankan media generally follows this quite reasonably well, but unfortunately, stories from southern India, either films or television programs or news items, carry suicide very big in their storylines. And that could be another reason why suicide is high among Sri Lankans. So media policy is a very important way of reducing suicides. And then, of course, we come to the macro systems here, where culture, religions, social acceptance all play a part. Now coming to suicide and mental illnesses, we will look at that a bit more in detail. As you can see in this diagram, mood disorders contribute about 35% to the suicide rate. As you know, depression is one of the commonest mental health problems and very often undiagnosed. We say the treatment gap is very large for mood disorders, and that is one problem. So when we do psychological postmortems, that is when we analyze a patient's history after the suicide, retrospectively, very often find out that they have had a mood disorder. Then, after mood disorders, the second group is substance abuse. As you can see here, alcohol and drugs play a very important part, and in our society, it's a problem. And then comes schizophrenia, accounting to about 10.6. Then personality disorders come. Then other anxiety, somatoform, adjustment disorders, and other diseases come. So as you can see here, if we have a good accessible mental health care and people can access services without facing too much stigma, and there is good understanding and knowledge among the public about mental illnesses, we can actually reduce the suicide rate by half. So that is something that we try to do. Then another indicator of suicide is previous suicide attempts. So the chance of suicide after deliberate self-harm actually doubles. So after a suicide attempts, about 20% of them, 20 to 40% of them actually could end up in a serious suicide attempt. And again, family history of suicide and mental disorders also increases the suicide risk. Yes. So can we actually predict suicide? The answer is no. We can identify the risk factors, but unfortunately, still suicide is such an uncommon event. As we saw in Sri Lanka, it's about 25 per 100,000 people. So though we can identify risk factors like mental disorders, like alcohol problems, like poor problem solving skills, when it comes to identifying an individual, there is no way that we can say this person is likely to commit suicide. And also remember, status can change. As we saw earlier, being single is a high risk factor. But a person who is single can get married, and then the risk factor is much less. So you can see this graph here. This line indicates the male suicide rate, and this one indicates this not so dark continuous line indicates the female suicide rate. And you can see here exofactors like world wars reduce the suicide rates. You can see a dip with the First World War and a bigger dip during the Second World War. We saw this in the war in Sri Lanka as well. Professor Daya Somasundaram has done a research about suicide rates before the war and then another one after the war or during the war. And we saw how the suicide rates were actually much less. And then again, the employment. You can see this interrupted line indicates unemployment rates during depression, during economic depression. So in the 1930s, there was a big economic depression in the United States, and that actually brought down the suicide rate very steeply. So that's another big factor that can play a very important role in suicides. Then again, it's another interesting phenomenon here, where there was an epidemic using barbiturates in the 1960s, where barbiturate was used as a hypnotic to induce sleep. And there were a large number of suicides. And you can see here how the female suicide rates actually spike, increase during the barbiturate epidemic. And when the epidemic went down, it went down. So naturally, this also supports the view that when media or by any other means, when people come to hear about a particular method of suicide, they tend to do it more. And that's why we want the media to control and manage suicide reporting. Yes. Again, coming to deliberate self-harm, why do people attempt suicide or deliberately harm themselves? One is because of acute problems they have, which is, I think, very common in Sri Lanka, and also sometimes chronic problems. It's often a cry for help. I have a problem, I don't know what to do, please help. So without doing that, people actually attempt self-harm. And also they do deliberate self-harm as a way of manipulating others. So I want some money from my parents, I want to chill with my friends, I threaten and I do deliberate self-harm. And very often what do the parents do? They give in. So the child learns, or the young adult learns this as a way of solving their problems. And often it ends up successful. But what happens is sometimes they overstep the mark and accidentally end their lives. Then again, poor problem solving skills are also another cause for deliberate self-harm. I don't know what to do, please help me. Then, as I said earlier, a cry for help. So, if we see a patient after deliberate self-harm, what are the factors that actually increase the suicide risk? One, a medically serious act of deliberate self-harm often indicates to a higher risk. For example, somebody taking 2 or 3 diazepams is less serious than somebody taking, say, 100 diazepams. Right? And also, the act itself, more violent acts are indicative of a higher suicide risk. So, somebody is trying to hang themselves is considered a more serious attempt than who somebody tries to take an overdose. And then again, taking precautions against being found is another indicator of the seriousness. So, somebody who makes sure there is nobody in the house, makes sure the room is locked, and then attempts suicide, as opposed to another person who attempts suicide in front of the family having a bottle of poison in his hand or her hand and saying, I am drinking it now. Obviously, the risk factor, the seriousness is different. And of course, another risk factor is previous attempt of deliberate self-harm. If somebody has been attempting deliberate self-harms a few times, then, as we said earlier, one time he could actually end up his life. Having a mental illness, especially depression and psychosis like schizophrenia, the risk of suicide is high. Then again, substance misuse is another factor that's going to increase the suicide risk. Another factor is comorbidity. Comorbidity is where somebody has a personality disorder and a mental illness, or a mental illness and substance abuse. So, when we have 2 or 3 factors together in a person, then again the suicide risk is high. Then again, impulsive and aggressive personality traits. People who are impulsive, who cannot postpone things, who do things at the spur of the moment. And again, people who are lonely and who have very poor social network are at higher risks. And again, elderly who all could have some of these above problems are all also at a higher risk for suicide. Yes. Again, if you look at where suicides happens, 80% of suicides happen in developing countries, 50% in urban areas, and in refugee camps, the suicide rates are very high. So, we know that, for example, in some research done in some of the refugee camps that were there in Vaunia, the suicide rates were more than 100 per 100,000, which was about more than double the national average, or more than that. Again, in children, bullying is one of the most important aspects, reasons for suicide. School bullying and also now cyberbullying has come as a big issue, where children use Facebook and other things to threaten, to demean, and cause unhappiness. So, suicide attempts due to bullying again is a very important aspect. Now, pesticides contribute to 300,000 deaths in our region, Asia Pacific region. And Sri Lanka, being an agriculture country, suicides by pesticides is the commonest method. So, there have been various attempts to reduce suicides by pesticides. As we saw earlier with the barbiturate poisoning, sedatives and suicide rates, accessibility, having access to medication, access to poisons is a very important aspect to suicide. Again, we talked about impulsivity. Very often suicides are not very much planned, they are spur of the moment. So, if there is some poison or if there is some access to a suicide method, they may not do it. So, we see this in USA, where some of the states have very strict gun control. So, people can't just go and buy guns. whereas other states have very lax gun control. So people can just go and buy. So gun ownership is very high in some states and low in some states. So the suicide rates are high in states that have very poor gun control or lax gun control. So people have guns. So when they want to commit suicide, they have a gun, they can shoot themselves. Whereas in states where there is strict gun control, they want to commit suicide, sorry, there is no gun because you can't buy a gun, and they just don't do it. So reducing access to pesticides in some way could be one important way that we can reduce suicides. Unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, the farmer lobby is very strong, and trying reducing access to pesticides is very difficult. Distributing pesticides through some farm unions or registered farmers is one way of doing that. Now, anybody can go and buy pesticides openly in shops. So that's a problem. And then again, access to poison. Poison is locked up in a cupboard with the key somewhere else and no easy access. Again, the chance of suicide is going to be less. But if the bottle is going to be lying there somewhere in the corner, then the chance of me taking it when I'm impulsive is very high. So there have been methods that have tried to do that. And then better medical management. So one of the reasons why suicide rates in Sri Lanka has come down in Sri Lanka is because of better medical management. In those days, a lot of patients who were admitted after organophosphate poisoning or allergy poisoning used to die. But medical management has improved, and many of these people don't die now, and that has actually reduced the suicide rates. So, as we saw earlier, teens are an important age group where people attempt suicide. So here I am giving some comments about what to tell parents about suicide. One, talk about it. Talking about suicide or asking a patient about suicide does not increase the suicide risk. So there used to be a myth that when a patient with mental illness comes, we should not ask about suicide because that may push the person into suicide. We know now that it's not true. So talking about suicide actually helps people. So don't worry about talking about suicide with your children. And also being connected with your children is another important way that we can reduce suicide. Help children to talk about their feelings. As you know, in Sri Lanka, we are not open about our feelings. We tend to express our feelings in our behavior rather than verbally. Actually, if we can learn to express our feelings verbally, then we may not express by behavior, which could be harmful. So it's much better for me to say, I feel very bad, I wish I was dead, rather than actually taking a poison, demonstrating it by my behavior. And again, I have given some advice here about what to do, which you can go through. Let us look at some of the protective factors that can actually reduce the suicide risk. One is being connected to the family. So improving our family links is very important. And then personal resilience and coping and problem solving skills. Now this is something actually parents and teachers can do. Improve problem solving skills in children. When the children face problems, rather than interfering and offering solutions, let them explore, let them try out different methods, and let them try and find their own solutions. Of course, this has to be age appropriate for us to allow it. And then giving responsibility for children and getting them to do stuff on their own. Again, family communications patterns also could be very harmful. We see that very often, over my dead body, I will allow you, if you do this, I will end my life. We very often see suicide being used as a threat to manipulate, to control others. This is very unhealthy. And this teaches children that suicide is an option when actually it is not. Then presence of significant others also reduces suicide risk, good physical and mental health, positive beliefs and values, having a good self-worth, knowing that I am important, I am useful, I can achieve things, and then again community and social integration. Now, one of the good examples of social integration is the war. We saw that during wars, during the Second World War and during the Sri Lankan War, the suicide rates actually went down. And one of the possible reasons for suicide rates going down is during times of war, the communities become much more cohesive. Community links become much more stronger. And very few people are actually marginalized. And this could be one way that suicide rates are reduced during times of war. And of course, as we saw, economic security and old age are high risk factors. So unfortunately in Sri Lanka, we still do not have unemployment benefit or illness benefit. So somebody is unemployed or somebody is ill and cannot work, are forced to be dependent on relatives and others, which reduces their self-worth and which could be pushing people towards suicide. So these are some of the important aspects. So when a person exhibits suicidal behavior, or when a patient is admitted after deliberate self-harm, how do we see these patients? Right? One of the things we need to understand is at that moment, unfortunately, this person saw deliberate self-harm as a way of solving their problems. They couldn't see any other way. So rather than blaming them, we need to understand their predicament. And also, it's not good to judge a person or criticize a person for attempting suicide, which is what we often see in hospitals. Doctors and nurses very often blame the patient and criticize the patient for doing something stupid, useless, harmful. We have to understand that they have some inner pain, some hurt, some suffering, which is pushing them to end their lives. And we need to understand that as a response to their suffering rather than a wrong act. So one of the things we need to do is to help them to explore, look at other ways of solving those problems. So thank you.